welcome this month Ambassador Fitz Haney, who is joining us live from Renana, Israel. As we were mentioning before we started the recording, it's been a very challenging time in Israel last few days, specifically with the launch of rockets. Unfortunately, people have died, and it's a very challenging situation going on there, and our thoughts are obviously, we had a Tehillim session last night here, and everyone around the world is really with our hearts, thoughts, prayers, and connection to Israel. Fitz, how are you doing, and how is your family doing with the situation there?
Like I said, thank God we're okay. It's my wife had a little PTSD because we were first here during the second Intifada in Yerushalayim, and that was a very difficult period. So to be back and hearing sirens all the time is not easy. But it's interesting as we have thank God 4 kids, and over the ages, the younger ones tend to be more Israeli, and so they take it completely different from the older ones. And so they went to school today. They didn't have to, but they're like, we'll go anyway. They know if Azakaf, a siren happens and we're in the street, we know what to do. Don't worry about it, Abba, we'll be fine. And so life goes on.
You've really become Israeli in that life goes on type of approach to things, as many of us have. My youngest son is presently there on his gap year. Many of us have family, relatives, and all of that, and that's what the reality is. Fitz and I initially met through a mutual friend, Mike Granoff, a very dear friend of ours, and he was messaging me last night that he was very upset because he was working late in Tel Aviv, and he had done food delivery service, and then the siren went off, and he had already paid for his food delivery, and it never showed up. So this was his big problem, that his dinner didn't make it because of the sirens and the situation. So, but that's certainly his coping mechanism of the way to handle the situation and his concern. I'm worried about the guy not getting enough nutrition in his life, and that's
yeah.
Anyhow. So thank you again for giving us that update, and hopefully we'll remain relatively quiet without any sirens during the interview conversation that we're having. And if anything does go off, we're going to try to pause and move to the Mamad and be able to continue, but we'll keep us posted there, Fitz. So just a little bit of bio and background of yourself, and your life history is fascinating. We met through, as I mentioned, his mutual friend, and he was fairly flip about just saying, "Oh yeah, he's just my Orthodox Jewish African American ambassador, involved in public service, private enterprise, all kinds of things in his life." And I'm just like, huh? Like, wow, that's such a diverse background. So, your life trajectory, being born in Tennessee, growing up in Chicago, if you wouldn't mind just filling in, folks from our community just a little bit about, where your trajectory has brought you to, and your kind of, upbringing and getting to, your life and path and points, and any kind of key points you may have in that.
Great. First, thank you for the opportunity to have the conversation, and I really do hope it's a conversation. I hope it's open, and I'm willing to answer almost any question, so I hope that we get some good ones. I wish I really could tell you how I got to where I got to, how I'm sitting here in Renana, Israel in 2021. But as you said, I was born originally in Tennessee and grew up outside of Chicago and Illinois. The joke my wife and I have is that when we first got married and we were living in Yerushalayim, people would very delicately kind of ask me, well, have you always been religious? Is that something that you grew up with? And I said, yes, I've always been very religious. I just happen to be Catholic. But yeah, I was very religious growing up, and we were a very religious family. And Catholicism played a very important role in my life, so much so that I chose my university, Georgetown, because it was a Jesuit university. And I wanted to continue that. And I was involved in student leadership, and I was involved in kind of campus ministries. I led silent retreats all through college. And then I went to Latin America after grad school, and I really couldn't find a faith community I connected with, which is a little strange because, Catholicism in Latin America is like Judaism here in Israel. There's a shul on every corner. So it would be really easy for me to find a shtibel or somewhere to go to say, hey, I'm going to go and just pray here. But I wasn't finding that connection. And so it was during my second time of living in Mexico City that I had a Jewish friend, and I approached him and said, hey, I grew up very well versed in the New Testament part of the Bible, but I really never studied the Old Testament. We kind of said, oh, we know it's there, but that's not really dealing with us. We have this new thing over here. And so I'd like to learn about the Old Testament. And is there anybody I can learn with? And he was kind of like, well, why would you want to do that? And I said, no, it's completely an intellectual enterprise. This is, I'm hoping that by delving into what we call the Old Testament, it will help me reconnect to my birth religion, which came out of Judaism anyway. So it's kind of like that was my thinking at the time. And so we found a rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi who was willing to learn with me, only after getting permission from the chief rabbi and also confirming that I wasn't dating anybody at the time that was Jewish, which I wasn't. And so we started to learn, and we learned together for 2 years. We learned twice a week. We did an hour of basic, Judaism, philosophy, textual studies, and I did an hour a week with him of Catholic philosophy, because he grew up in Uruguay, and he always wanted to study some of the great Catholic philosophers, but his parents were very worried at the time that, being such a minority in such a large majority religion, that it wouldn't be good for him to do. But his point was like, look, I'm a rabbi now in an Orthodox shul in Mexico City. I think they'll be okay with me now studying some Catholicism. So we did that for about 2 years. And about halfway through, I walked into his office one day and I said, Rabbi, this started as an intellectual pursuit, but it's changed for me. And I'm feeling drawn and called toward Judaism. And I really think I need to explore this path. And he said, yeah, no problem. He goes, I could have told you that after our third meeting, but I had to have you come to tell me that. And that was my first instance. I was like, well, Judaism could be a little more efficient. I mean, you didn't have to wait for me to learn with you for a whole year to get to the point where you tell me, yeah, I knew from the questions and from the path and how you were becoming involved that this might become more for you. And then he said, look, it's going to be very difficult. I'll just be honest with you. It's not an easy thing to do. We don't convert in Mexico at all. So you can't do it here. So you have to either go to the United States or go to Israel. And I'm not a very impulsive person, but my first thought in my head was, look, if I'm going to be a Jew, I have to go to Israel. I mean, that's where I have to be. So I walked in my boss's office and said I needed to do a sabbatical. I was the youngest vice president at Citibank International at the time. And I said, look, I need to do a sabbatical in Israel. And he's like, we're about to make the largest consumer bank transaction in Citibank's history. And why do you want to leave now? I kind of explained to him. He happened to be very, very religious Catholic, Opus Dei. And he said, look, I hate to lose you to Catholicism, but he spent a year in Israel when he was 25. And he said it was the best year of his life. He said, if this is what the path that God's telling you to go down, I'll support you and we'll get you a sabbatical and go to Israel. And so I did and came to Israel.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, when you broke this to your family and I know you said you grew up very religious and very connected to your parents, your grandparents, your siblings. They must have been like, is this really what you're interested in? Is this really the direction you want to go?
Yeah, to put it mildly, yes. My mother's reaction was exactly what one would hope you hear from your mother, which was, look, I brought you and your brother up to be thinking, feeling independent adults. And if this is the path that you think is best for you, I will support you, which was great. I didn't know at the time that, and I found out later, that she actually went to my childhood priest, Father Mike, and went to him and said, what are we going to do? She's like, I said the right thing to him, but now what are we going to do about this? And his response, and I think this is part of being a Jesuit within Catholicism, was, look, Sandra, my mom, Sandra, if this is a path that either Fitz has chosen or God's chosen for him, I'm positive that God would rather have Fitz be a dedicated Jew than a non-affiliated Catholic. And so we need to support him in this. And so that kind of got her over the hump. And the rest of the family, with the exception of my grandmother, was really good. My grandmother was very, very difficult. She prayed a lot for me for a long time. But at the end, she came around as well. So thank God before she passed away, she came around, she came to my wedding. We had an Orthodox, wedding, and she came and she embraced it. And now the entire family is, probably as well versed in Judaism as many American Jews are. So, yeah.
That's wonderful to hear. And it's fascinating how your conversion really almost converted them almost in a way, in understanding and bringing your connection to Judaism, really back to your family and all of that. So I wanted to have a conversation more about a few other things, and just to the rest of the folks who have joined us from the show and other places, if you want to put anything in the chat of any questions that you may have, I would love to jump in and put any questions in as well. But I just wanted to touch upon some of your, obviously African-American, Black background in being now a Jew. I mean, now you've converted yourself. We've gotten to that part of your life that you are Jewish, and your identity of being both Black and Jewish. How do you take that as a kind of, it's not easy being Black, it's not easy being Jewish, and you seem to take it as a source of strength in a way, and not as some source of problem or difficulty. You actually embrace it. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. It was actually at my first Beit Din. I say my first because I actually converted 3 times, but that's a whole different story. But at my first Beit Din, one of the rabbis did ask me, he said, the old joke, what, being Black wasn't hard enough, and now you want to be Jewish too? And so there is, but behind that is in all good comedy, there's some truth to it. So I in a way, I've always been kind of other. I grew up as one of very few African Americans in my town at the time. Matter of fact, until my brother was old enough to go to school with me, I was the only one in my school. Then I spent time abroad in high school, and then I lived abroad majority of my adult life, actually. And so that part of being different from a lot of the mainstream was already very inherent of who I am. And so the identity of being Black and then being Jewish, although, the recent Pew study, which was just released, yesterday or the day before, says 8% of American Jews claim to be non-white, which is very interesting. But that part of that kind of dual identity is just, it's become so much who I am that it is hard for me to separate it. And I think it's harder for other people to react to it than it is for me, in all honesty. I'll have a meeting in New York, for example, at a Starbucks, and somebody will describe somebody I haven't met before, a business meeting will say, well, who shall I be looking for? And one of my friends for the longest time would be like, well, he's going to be a guy in there. He's wearing probably a knitted kippah. You'll see him, da-da-da. And I finally said, no. I'm like, what's the issue? Say he's a Black guy with a kippah on. There's not going to be too many of us. So that's really the easiest way to find me. And so that is who we are. I don't want to get into politics, but this recently on my last trip to the States, actually before COVID hit, my 9-year-old daughter came into my room and said, Abba, you're going to America, and are you going to wear your kippah? And I said, yeah, probably. Why? And she's like, well, I just want to know, who in America do they hate more, Blacks or Jews? And she's like, because you're both. And so is it going to be harder for you to be Black or harder for you to be Jewish? I'm like, okay, this is a great conversation.
Because only a 9-year-old can ask. In that.
Yeah. I'm like, okay, Shia, let's sit down and Daddy will stop packing the suitcase and let's talk about this. But obviously in her world, she absorbs things from her older sibling. She sees things on TV, and she saw what was happening in the United States, and she knows we have friends that have been victims of anti-Semitic violence in the United States in the last few years. And we've talked about it at the Shabbos table, and it's her older siblings are very much into social justice and social action. And so for her, it was just natural to say, is it better for you to be one or the other, or can you deny one or the other? And I think it was just another good example for me to say, well, I'm both, and I can't deny either. And one's, I think, more noticeable automatically than the other one, but they're both part of who I am. And my answer to her was like, America doesn't hate either. There are people in America that have problems with both, but we have to be proud of who we are. So
exactly. And I haven't had a chance to read the full Pew study yet at this point. Just a few other things going on. But I did catch somewhere, I came across my wire, that this Shabbat is a virtual Shabbaton of Jews of color. I forgot which group was hosting such an event, but and I forgot it had virtualized, and I didn't join it, but it's I think starting to acknowledge that Jews are a very diverse people in the kind of non-Jewish society and the media and the news and the culture. We have this very typical view of what your white Ashkenazi Jew actually is in all of that. And, you're giving some examples of this, rich culture and diversity of Jews, of color, and those who, like yourself, are, fully Jews. I know you know Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein, who was our speaker last month, who I think is actually speaking at this exact time slot with Erica Brown, where you spoke. So we're kind of playing the musical chairs in that way of that. But what's your experience been in Israel, and your decision to raise your kids in Israel, and your wife, who is white, and the biracial kids that that are being raised Israeli, and that experience?
It has been interesting. I mean, one of the reasons that we initially thought to leave what was a very comfortable and wonderful life in Englewood, New Jersey, was because we thought that our kids, as biracial Jews, are probably a lot more likely to see people who look like them here in Israel than they would back in the United States. To your point, that in one thing I think Israel has not done a very good job at ever is talking about the diversity within the Jewish community here in Israel. Everything from Yemenite to Ethiopian to Mizrahi to Ashkenazi to Sephardi Jews. And so you have every hue, every color that exists represented here in Israel. So a big part of what we thought was, look, they'll at least be able to look on the street and see people who look like them who are Jewish. And so that would be an easier touchstone for them. So that I think in a lot of ways that's borne out, and that's been the case. In a lot of other ways, it's also challenging because Israel's Israel, and Israel's not the United States. And so people will ask and say things here that they wouldn't ever think about saying, or they think about it, but they wouldn't vocalize it back in the States. So, there'll be times when, my wife is with some of the kids, and they'll go up and say, what's your relation? Whose kids are these? And she's like, well, since I gave birth to them, they're mine. I know that. And they're like, oh, really? Or one of my daughters will be on a bus, and, it happened last time there was an Ethiopian protest, and, they look at her and they're like, well, why are you people doing this? And she's like, I'm not Ethiopian, but, let me talk to you about so it's been an interesting experience, I think, for all of us. I do think overall it's been a positive one, at least on the racial, cultural, ethnic side of things, but, it's challenging,
Certainly, certainly it has to be, and just kind of talking about your background, and obviously, when you were living here in the United States, and some of the encounters that I'm sure you've faced because of your racial identity and how you present yourself in that way. You had shared a story. I think it was in the Erica lecture about when you were a child, and you were, it was the Daughters of American Revolution or something. It was a competition that you were part of. How did that shape your consciousness of how people view you as a
I think it was probably the first time you have memories as growing up. It was one of the most vivid ones I have of, oh, this is different, and they're looking at me differently because I'm Black. There was a daughter of the American Revolutions who actually my mother was part of, which always freaked them out, but she was, because our family had been, that part of the family's been in the United States for like 400 years. So, they had a speaking contest, and I won the contest. And so you got to go to this kind of regional breakfast at the time. And so I get there, I forget, late single digits probably, or very early double digits. So anywhere between like 9 and 12 probably. And dressed up, and it's great. And it's a great pancake breakfast. You're going to get there. And my name, which is Stafford Fitzgerald Haney, is in a placard on the table. And so I see my name, and I go up to the table, sit down, and this very nice woman comes over to me, and she's like, honey, I think you're in the wrong place. And I'm like, well, unless there's another Stafford Fitzgerald Haney somewhere in here, this is where I sit. But I mean, the name and her perception of who it should fit with and who should be at this, I was the only Black kid there as well. It didn't match. And so for me, it was kind of like, oh, she doesn't think that this is me, and this is who I am, and this is part of who I am, obviously. So, I had to talk to my mom about it, and she had to explain, and we kind of walked through it. And that's one of the things, and even here in Israel, it's you said earlier that being Black and Jewish and being doubly diverse, if you want to say, I use it as a form of strength, and it is, and I thank God every day that this is a path that He's put me on. But at the same time, it can be a burden. That was the first time that my mother said to me, and she goes, "Look, this is going to happen to you a lot in your life," and in her viewpoint, and I've kind of taken it on, and also with my children, is that you can't let this define you, and you have to always look at this in as positive ways you can, because your response and your interaction with other people will color the way that they treat other people that they encounter that look like you or believe like you or are like you. And so, here in Israel, like I said, when they ask my wife or they ask my daughter, well, you Ethiopians, or, I tell them you have to take a deep breath, and you have to say, okay, so how am I going to respond to this?
Right.
And for me, once I was actually in Tashkent, in Uzbekistan, I was on the subway, and I was there for a work project for a number of weeks. And I would take the subway because I always like to try to see what the local life is like. And so, one day I was very tired. You just want to get back to one of the Soviet style hotels they had at the time. And every time I got on the subway, everything stopped. It became silent. And okay, so you get used to after your 4th, 5th, 6th day. And, people would then kind of come up to me, and they'd want to touch me, and they want to touch my hair. And you're like, okay, I just want to get to my hotel, and I'm a human being, and I'm not a zoo animal. But, and this one day I was just very exhausted. It had been a long day. And my initial reaction was like, look, my Russian's horrible, but I'm going to say something really nasty in Russian because I don't want this interaction today. And I had to stop myself, because I realized that for many of the people that are on that subway car, I was going to be the only person of African descent they probably saw in their lifetime in person. And so, not in the movies and not on TV, and not listening on the radios and music or whatever. And so my reaction would then color how they saw perhaps, a whole race of people. And so it's a huge burden you have to take at times, but you just have to take a deep breath and say, and it's the same thing if, Marata Ayin, if you're wearing a kippah and you do something that isn't really nice, you really have to think about it, because it's not just, you may not be a nice person at one time, but then the person that sees you, especially if it's a non-Jew, is going to sit there and go, oh, those people are like that.
Exactly.
And
yeah,
so,
I see Rabbi Weinstock nodding his head, and this is obviously a message that we take from as well, that we are ambassadors of Judaism. When we wear a kippah on our head, you obviously have to put a kippah on your head because you don't present yourself in a typical Jewish persona, because of being Black, but I'm in Publix last night, our local grocery store, and I'm walking through the aisles with my kippah on, and somebody needs help on a shelf, or somebody is bumping into someone else or something out, and how am I presenting myself in this in general society in that way. So I use the term ambassador, and I guess the pun or the double entendre is yourself. We have promoted you as an ambassador, so I would be remiss to mention that you were the United States ambassador to Costa Rica, I believe from 2014 or 2015, I think, until sometime in the early Trump administration, 2017 or so, and served in this role in fantastic role, being able to get this type of thing, and maybe you want to just talk a little bit about that, and then you had mentioned a story also on the Erica interview about your encounter when you had to come back to the United States on a diplomatic passport. So can you share a little bit about your ambassador life, so to speak, and the gig that you had there? I won't mention the Dancing with the Stars part, but that's okay.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a fantastic way to serve. Honestly, people say, thank you for your service. I'm like, it really wasn't a sacrifice. It was an amazing opportunity. It was an amazing job. We enjoyed it very much. And it's interesting because we were obviously ambassadors, for the U.S. And I say anybody that's abroad is always an ambassador with a little a anyway. But we were the official ambassadors at the time. But at the same time, because Judaism is such a big part of who we are, we also became kind of ambassadors for Judaism down in Costa Rica. Costa Rica is fortunate in that it has a very good relationship with the Jewish communities and the non-Jewish community. And I think it's the only other place except Israel where you actually walk into their Knesset, their Congress building, and you actually see it's hard to quote, you see the 10 Commandments in Hebrew up there. They have them up there, and they've had a Jewish vice president, and they've had a Jewish ambassador to the UN from Costa Rica. So it's a community that's done very well and been very integrated in Costa Rica. But we, one of our criteria when their offer was kind of presented like an ambassadorship, I said, well, it needs to be a country that speaks Spanish or Portuguese, because I speak those. And I think it's important for the ambassador to communicate in the local language. It needs to have a Jewish community, because that's important to us. And it needs to have a Jewish day school, because our kids have gone to Jewish day schools their whole life. And so that kind of narrowed it down to 5 or 6 countries around the world. There aren't that many that fit that bill. And Costa Rica came up, and we said, fantastic. But a lot of what we did, a lot of who we presented ourselves, it was always mentioned, and he happens to be an African-American. They'd had an African-American before as ambassador. They had a Jew before as an ambassador. They never one that combined the two.
That's right. You got a package deal here.
There you go.
All in one. So.
And so a lot of what we did from a Jewish perspective, became amplified somewhat in Costa Rica. So, if we had Sukkot, we had our sukkah, and we invited people over for a representative dinner. Then it was like, what is Sukkot, and why is this important to you? And let's do a story about that. And why do you do Hanukkah, not Christmas? And let's do a story about that. Why isn't there a Christmas tree in the ambassador's residence for the first time ever? Because I didn't want my kids around a Christmas tree. They never had one. I didn't want them to have one in their house. You could have one in the embassy, that's fine. But even though it was a government house, it was still, we were living there. So. But that was a huge issue, which I didn't appreciate as much as I probably should have, with a lot of the employees there who like going to the ambassador's house. There's always this huge Christmas tree. It's a huge part of what they do. All of a sudden we come down there, we're like, yeah, no, we're not going to have a Christmas tree. Sorry. So it was an amazing thing to do. It was a lot of fun. But it had its challenges. The story you mentioned about coming back is, I had to come back for a meeting at the White House, and there are no direct flights from Costa Rica, so I was flying via Houston. And when you travel on official travel, you use your diplomatic passport, and so I was using my black diplomatic passport. And I go up to the customs immigration guy, and I'm going to check in. I hand him my passport, and he kind of looks at me, and he looks at the passport, and he's like, "Well, where did you get this?" And I'm like, "Well, I got this because I happen to be the U.S. ambassador to Costa Rica." And he's like, "Uh-huh." And I'm like, well, if you look at the last page of the passport, it's actually stamped there. This is our representative, extraordinary and plenipotentiary ambassador to the Republic of Costa Rica. But again, it was another example of in his mind, I didn't fit what he thought an ambassador would look like. So who am I and where did this come from and how did I get this passport? I think much to his chagrin, he did not realize that one of my key meetings was with the Department of Homeland Security that trip. And I made sure that they heard what my experience was like going through Houston. And that's, unfortunately something that you hear a lot about, a lot of Foreign Service officers, but it happened to me as well.
Right. These type of, microaggressions that encounter on a very daily basis. I mean, you mentioned this story when you were 10 or 11 years old, and now you mentioned this story when you were, I don't know, 3, 4, or 5 years ago, whenever this happened to you. Sounds like very little has changed in certain people's perceptions and what that a person who presents themselves, with a black skin tone of what they should be, and they in their mindset of what that is, and how that makes you feel, kind of in that way, and as a person of myself who presents themselves as white and presents themselves in this way, often don't get those type of microaggressions, or like the encounter you said you had in the Uzbek subway, or I forgot exactly where that was, or in the airport TSA situation in that way, or even it's the simple things. You mentioned a story about even hailing a taxi, or things like that, and how those microaggressions tend to color. Not really, sort of a pun intended, about that. So do you want to just talk a little bit more about that, or how that kind of makes you feel?
Yeah, it's been obviously the last couple of years, especially with what's going on in the States, it's been an ongoing conversation. And especially with a lot of my Jewish friends here in Israel and Jewish friends back in the States, and especially the more Orthodox Jewish friends I have. And it is, we had a very long discussion actually a couple of weeks ago with a very good friend of mine who, wanted to challenge me on the fact that I think that institutional racism does exist in the United States. And he's like, well, what do you mean by this? And is that just a crutch? And these are very open, I'm a person who says, if you don't have the ability to have an open and honest conversation, you don't have the ability to learn from each other, and we'll never move from where we are. And so, it sounds a little harsh when I say it, but when we have these conversations, we both know where, look, it's respectful, and we actually very like each other a lot. It's just a way for us to say, hey, I don't have a lot of touch points like this, so I want to ask you. And I said, and I used some of these examples and said, yeah, I'd be remiss to say things have not gotten better, because they have. They have in general. But I think we'd also be remiss not to say that we still have a very long way to go, and we haven't gone as far as people thought we had. And so, we were talking about, is racism in the United States, is it institutional? Is it something that's so deep in who we are? Or is this something that, it happens and some people are and some people aren't? And I said, to me, it's baked in our Constitution. It's from the founding documents of our country, how it defined somebody who was Black for lots of political reasons at the time. But it says, you're 3/5 of a human being. And we do that because the South wanted to be able to count property toward their population, so they had more representation in Congress. And the North at the time wanted to have this union happen, so they gave in on that. But I said that in itself is the beginning of what is institutional racism for the United States. And we went back and forth for a while. And I said, well, let's take a step back. And I said, let's look at it in a Jewish context from institutional anti-Semitism in Europe. And how that over thousands of years developed, and how there were laws and statutes that you couldn't have certain professions. You had to live in certain ways. You couldn't like meet with other people. You had to pay certain tithes to, either, the Islamic or the Christian rulers at the time, because you had the privilege of living in their societies, and how that, once it's institutionalized over time, what that does to our people and where that can lead to, unfortunately. And so, it's a very insidious thing, but it does exist. And when people say, I think this whole intersectionality in this, and especially within the Jewish community, is a very interesting topic. And as a Jew, and having been on both sides of, because I'm in an interesting position also when people don't know I'm Jewish and what they say about Jews. But yes, I think there is a big push these days in the United States, because the Jewish community in the United States has done fairly well over the last at least 50 years. And people tend to forget that, well, you go back to the early 20th century and before, things weren't as rosy as they are today, but things have definitely improved. And so, you yourself said, as you present white, and yes, from an outside appearance, and if no one sees your kippah, then they're gonna say, oh, okay, yeah, Steve's white. And there does carry a certain level of privilege and just assumptions behind that. But to me, it's we're not there yet, because as soon as somebody finds out you're Jewish, it completely changes the categories they put you in. And so on the one hand, people are saying, yes, well, Jews, and they don't understand, and they get passed for white, and but we all know from history, and we know still today, that that's not true. Because as soon as somebody finds out you're Jewish or you have a Jewish background, it completely changes the categories they put you in and the privileges that come with those categories. And so I think, yeah.
You've hit upon a lot of, excellent, awesome points, and definitely, Jews have, shall we say, improved our situation in education and in job opportunities and health and housing and all of these things. Certainly, my opinion vis-a-vis other ethnic groups, unfortunately, there's been in the last 5 years, a rise, in the United States of anti-Semitic incidents, of things that have come out, and recently, unfortunately, with Asian American Pacific Islanders, and the misinformation and frank out lies about the COVID virus and all of that, and it tends to show how some of this, as you say, institutional racism and stuff that's been, shall we say, baked into our society. I had spent some time reading, and I made my mother, who's on here as well, read Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, which, if those on the call haven't read, I feel an excellent historical book in discussing the caste being a form of how different levels within society and how skin tone really from even pre-founding of the United States, and once Europeans came to the North American land and looking at skin tone and color and ways to differentiate people's caste within society, and as Fitz mentioned, much of the laws and society of things that was just formed, baked into the society exactly the way. And I love your correlation with how Jews were treated in, the Islamic and Christian, Europe and other parts of the world, and how their stature was in that way. So, it's certainly, kind of interesting, and I think to speak about it in that way. Let me just, I'll invite anyone, from the group, if they want to put anything into the chat. I have a question that came in here from Rabbi Fred Klein, who I want to acknowledge, another member of our committee, and always a super insightful and wonderful guy who I've known for many years, and knows my brother-in-law for many years. So he asked, what from your Catholic and Jesuit upbringing can inform a Jewish community, specifically the Orthodox community, because again, we're from an Orthodox shul here, and anything that you like to think about or
I
share.
just want to add that my son is at Georgetown now doing an MA and JD at Georgetown, and he loves it there. So I might connect you both.
Fantastic. I'd love to be connected.
International affairs, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Perfect. It's a very good program. Congratulations. I think it's interesting because it's obviously there was a break with Vatican II with the theoretical change in how Catholicism looked at Judaism and Jews in general. And I think a lot of the modern Catholic Church, at least, I can't talk to all Protestants, but the modern Catholic Church that I grew up in is further along than it used to be. Having said that, there's still a long way to go. I do think there is a lot of admiration in most Catholic theology around Tikkun Olam, around Tzedakah, around some of the key tenets that Catholicism then took on itself from Judaism. And a lot of the Catholic schools look at Jewish practice and Jewish philosophy and theology and say that, oh, okay, there's a touchstone for us. There's a way we could connect. That's something that, we understand. That's something that we pretend that we're supposed to be doing a lot of as Catholics as well. And yeah, this is a great example of people who've done this for thousands of years around the world as well. So I think there's a kinship there. And so I think that that's something that is very good. I do think in general that, and I know the history behind it, but I made the joke earlier about, Judaism can be more efficient. Well, Judaism can't be more efficient because for many years, it was a crime punishable by death to think about trying to convert somebody to Judaism. So we didn't talk about it. We didn't do it. Not that you couldn't do it, but it was very, very, you had to be very, very careful about it. And I always say that one of the fastest growing religions around the world is Mormonism. And they do a very good job of getting out there and making sure that they tell their story. I think there's a lot of ways that the non-Jewish world tells their story a lot better than we do. And I think, like I said, there's historical context to why we feel we may not be able to, or we haven't in the past. But I do think that's something that we need to do more of. And we need to be more proactive, and not in your face way, but just kind of remind people that, look, these tenets have a lot of history. They come from one place, and this is something that we share. And so I think there's a lot of that a lot of the non-Jewish world does really well that we could do better.
I think that's a great message, and it's something that we're as part of our committee here looking to do with other communities of color here in South Florida, and looking at some of those opportunities to just help build those bridges, and say that is part of who we are as Orthodox Jews, and connection to their communities as well. That there's a lot of overlap in that way. Unfortunately, as obviously there's been some souring of this Black relationship, within the United States. I mean, you've mentioned history with Rabbi Heschel, some of your Jewish name with Rabbi Heschel, and some of the history. I was just reading, where was it? Wall Street Journal, I think, this past Saturday's edition had a whole story about the beauty of Shabbat, and talked extensively also about Rabbi Heschel and his connections in that way. But there was a lot of positive history, for some time, and there's been now, unfortunately, some negative incidents and individual things, and then just kind of some souring in some of that relationship. And as you alluded to in your previous answer, there's a lot of positive things that we can help to bridge that Black Jewish relationship in that divide. We have this common story of slavery that our slavery was 3,000 plus years ago, and here in the United States, slavery officially ended 150 years ago or so, and it's taken quite a while for the Jews to kind of get their ability to do that. But I look at the state of Georgia and the election of a Black senator and a Jewish senator, in a place like the state of Georgia, which I just kind of didn't even imagine in my lifetime I would ever see such a thing. And certain things happen, but I find it encouraging in that there are places and opportunities that are there. As an ambassador on both sides, so to speak, of those communities, what do you see? What are your thoughts about some of that intersectionality between the Black and the Jewish communities in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you, and I grew up in a household where civil rights were very important, and the understanding of the Jewish contribution to civil rights in the United States was very well known. And so my grandparents would talk about the fact that NAACP, some of the first 9 official members were Jews. 5 of the 9 were. And the history of Jewish activism and Jews coming down from especially the Northeast to the South, and some unfortunately paying the ultimate price. Yeah, trying to march and advance and do this because it's the right thing to do. And so it's been on one hand, very painful to see a split. It was traditionally a very good relationship become, I think, very difficult in the last decade or two. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. And every time that some African-American, sports star or music star or entertainer or whatever comes out and says something, really anti-Semitic, which has happened more often than not in the last few years, I always take a deep breath, because it's like, where does that come from? And then what is the reaction within the Jewish community? But there have been you alluded to a number of very difficult situations, from Crown Heights back in the 80s all the way forward to some of the anti-Semitic attacks we've seen in the United States as of recently, which have been perpetuated by African Americans. And so I think part of it, and I asked my, Black African American friends, their perceptions, and talk to my family about this. And I think part of it is what we alluded to earlier, is the fact that the Jewish community has been very successful, or more successful than other minority groups, of moving forward in the United States and realizing the ultimate, American dream. And, from education to economic empowerment to, social mobility, where there are other minorities that haven't been as successful. And so I think where the Jews and the Blacks probably started and thought there was a great kinship there, one group didn't move forward, and the other group kind of stagnated and is very slowly getting there. And so I think there's a little resentment there. I think, unfortunately, what we're seeing happening today in Israel in real time also plays a role in this. I think that the entire idea of people of color and brown and Black is translated fully to the Palestinian-Israeli issue. And it's looked at as, the Palestinians are the African Americans in Israel. It's not correct, but that's the narrative that's been very well accepted within U.S. society, especially U.S. society left of center. And so I think that also plays a huge role in it, because you see, a mostly white, what people think are colonists, with superior weaponry against these, native brown and brown people in the Middle East. And so all that gets kind of thrown together. I do think there are ways, and I talked to Senator Warnock actually before his election, because he had said a number of things that people took as being, well, at the very least, eye-opening. Like, is this bordering on something that, is not going to be good for the Jews or not? And I talked to a lot of my Jewish friends and said, no, I've talked to him. I know him. I know where he's coming from. And I said, what you may not know is what Black theology looks like in the United States, what the history of Black theology was, and the liberation theology behind that, and why some of the things that might have been said will strike you wrong, but where they're really coming from. And I think a lot of it is just the lack of ability to have that kind of interaction, and for really people to think. And I think on both sides, I always say to my African-American friends and family, anti-Semitism is one of the oldest antis in the world. And if we don't stand up and say, well, this is a problem, it only spreads. Mm-hmm. And so it only gets worse. So if it's bad for the Jews, it eventually gets bad for other groups as well. And that's in history has just shown that to us time and time again. And then on the Jewish side, I think we have to, to your point, remind my Jewish friends that we do have a shared history, of slavery, especially when we just went through, Pesach. 7 weeks ago now, but we went through Pesach. We do have a shared history here, but to your point, the history is very different. One history is 3,000 years ago, one history is 150 years ago. And so to think about where we probably were 150 years coming out of Egypt compared to where we were today, and so there has to be an understanding of there's a process that you have to go through, and as a much more recent trauma from a slavery perspective in the African-American community than in the Jewish community.
The term trauma is so apropos. And again, reading some of Isabel Wilkerson's book and physical trauma, emotional trauma, institutional trauma that, was imposed and is imposed on the African-American community today is trauma, and PTSD is that's because of what just took place in a lot of these ways, and it's really it behooves all Jews and all people to recognize that and to acknowledge that and to account for that, and that you can't just get over it. You can't just say like, oh yeah, it's just, that was ancient history. Just get over it and just move on with your life. I mean, this is really in that way. A quick joke that I unfortunately had a dog attack 3 weeks ago. My little dachshund was viciously attacked in my driveway, and I was standing there as my dog was literally attacked by a 100-pound dog. And I was traumatized that my little dog had his leg basically, almost ripped off his body from another dog. And that traumatized me. And I'm thinking like, wait a second, like, what happens to human trauma, and God forbid, some of the current situation going on there, and the horrible tragedy in Meron and other true, traumas that people have in their life. And certainly, communities have these type of traumas as well. And the African-American community has, and is in a lot of ways, suffered some of these traumas. And then when there are incidents, and there are, I'll call them civil rights incidents, whether, Ahmaud Arbery or Breonna Taylor or George Floyd or whoever the names are of people who have had these, that just reopens those wounds of that trauma that, communities have felt. So, being sensitive and acknowledging and being aware of what that, how that impacts people, is so important, for all of us in that way.
Yeah, and see, as you just said that, something just popped into my mind, which, Rabbi asked, what can the Orthodox Jewish community take away from maybe the Catholicism? And something you just said to me, and I hadn't thought about this before, but, Jewish trauma is historical, and it's thousands of years. And when you look at but also Latino, but especially the African-American community, they're very communities of deep faith as well. And so there is probably something within the Jewish experience and how Jews have been able to deal with trauma time and time and time again. Because it doesn't stop. It's going on today, but it's been forever. That if we could distill that and talk on that level with some of these other communities that have suffered their own trauma, there may be a way of reconnecting. There also may be a way of transmitting some of the resilience and some of the hope Because like I said, it's based in faith and it's based in belief. And those are also very deeply believing in faithful communities. And so there may be something there that we can contribute from the Jewish side to say, we get it and we understand. And this is how we have over thousands of years dealt with this. It may not be exactly how you should deal with it, but
Right.
at least there's an experience here that can be shared and something that
Right.
may be useful for you or not.
And you mentioned the hope, and which is the Hatikva, which is exactly the Jewish response in developing the state of Israel out of the ashes of the Holocaust. Thank you, Yitzhak Shelley, for mentioning that in the chat as well. I mean, that, incredible trauma, to our people that have suffered that, and be able to rise literally from the ashes and build the incredible modern state of Israel, and come through in that way. So just one last question. If my mom asks a question, I have to bring up mom about your comfort level in Renana, and why when you and your wife decided to come to Renana, other than the Granoffs, who of course live in Renana and are dear friends. I don't know if that was the reason you went there, or why. Israel is an interesting place, very different, obviously, in the United States in terms of communities and in terms of decisions to be in individual places in Israel. And what was Renana like for you?
Yeah, it's interesting because I resisted moving to Renana for 15 years. I wanted to live anywhere but in Renana. And my thinking at the time was, it's very similar. I always say it's kind of a combination between Teaneck and Englewood, New Jersey. So it's kind of like, and I used to make
Which isn't very different.
Yeah, I used to make fun of my friends who lived in Renana, because I would say, oh, the great thing about Renana is that it's really close to Israel, because you're not really in a typical Israeli environment.
Right.
And I wanted my kids to have a much more typical Israeli environment. And so when we moved originally, which we thought was going to be for a year, from Inglewood, we moved to Zichron Yaakov, because I was like, it's beautiful, it's wine country, I'm overlooking the Mediterranean, number one, so why wouldn't I want to live there? But it's also a more Israeli experience, whereas Renana wasn't. Having said that, Renana is a very easy landing place for people because it is more familiar. I would say my personal experience has been fairly positive. We have a lot of friends that we've known here for years and years. I think it's been harder for the kids than I had imagined. And what I hear from them, they're experiencing things here that I experienced growing up as one of the few, people of color or minorities in my town at the time. And I didn't think they'd have to hear that here, and they have been. And so you have a fairly affluent, well-educated, modern Orthodox community, but still within that, they have daily, what they consider macro or microaggressions on, things that are said in their presence or things that are said to them that they're just like, well, wait a minute, do you realize that what you said is just really racist? And the person's like, no, I didn't. Well, of course not. And he's like, well, it was, and no one else in their peer group, standing up and saying, well, wait a minute, you shouldn't be saying things like that. So it always falls upon them. It's incumbent upon them to say, that makes me uncomfortable. And this is why, and very little allyship. So that surprises me. As an adult, and maybe just because I'm older, I don't feel that. It doesn't bother me, and it is what it is. But I think for them, that's been surprising for me, because I would have.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and not something I would have, like you, being an older person, would not have immediately expected, in that way. But it's a bit of a long road to walk in getting to this point of understanding what those microaggressions mean and how they impact people. So the time has come to the end of our call. I could talk to you for hours, and I really wish you the best in surviving the current situation of what hopefully everyone will calm down and things will resume back a bit of peace and normalcy back to a very beautiful place in Renana, Israel. I hope to see you sometime directly face-to-face in person, whether you are in Florida or whether I'm in Israel. Unfortunately, I did not make it there this year when my son was there in his gap year, but God willing, sometime soon I will be able to travel and get over and to see you. I
Well,
thank you.
you're more than welcome. We'd love to have you. So
Thank you for your time. And on behalf of our show and our community, I really appreciate your conversation, your thoughts, and definitely ideas that we all can really take to heart in ways and defined actions of ways that we can help to push that Black Jewish connection forward. And your perspective, as someone who was not, as you referred, birth religion was not Jewish, and you are an incredible ambassador both in the Black community, the Jewish community, and for the United States government when you were in Costa Rica as well. So thank you again, Fitz.
thank you guys. Thank you for the opportunity. And thank you for the conversation.
Great, so much.